The Amhara region of Ethiopia has recently been thrust into a new crisis with clashes between local militias and the Ethiopian National Defense Force escalating tensions. This comes just months after the end of a devastating conflict in the neighboring Tigray region. Now, the ongoing violence in Ethiopia's Amhara region has not only disrupted the lives of its inhabitants, but has also posed significant challenges to humanitarian aid efforts. As local militias clash with the Ethiopian National Defense Force, access to critical resources has been hindered, impacting vulnerable populations. Today on the program, we will explore the unfolding situation with a representative from the Amhara Association of America, delving into the historical context, the motivations behind the conflict, and the implications for regional stability. We'll also aim to provide a deeper understanding of the complexities surrounding the crisis in the Amhara region. I am Kamini Amano, and you're welcome to the square. Joining our gathering today are Robel Alemo. He's Director of Communications for the Amhara Association of America. We also have Binyam Ambachu, who is member of the Genocide Prevention in Ethiopia. Gentlemen, you're welcome to the square. Indeed. I do want to start with you. Fantastic. I want to start with you, Binyam. How is this violence between, the local forces in Amhara and the Ethiopian National Defense Force reminiscent of what happened in Tigray? Are we looking at another Tigray type of conflict brewing in Ethiopia?
Thank you so much for having me. So, to first give a bit of a context, the war that's happening in Amhara region, first things first, these are not a group of militia. These are the sons and daughters and the children of the Amhara people. The Fano, as I like to consider them as freedom fighters, are fighting to protect and defend the Amhara people from an attack, from the genocidal attack of Abiy Ahmed Ali. The war that happened in 2020 between the federal forces and the TPLF involved when the TPLF attacked and decimated the Northern Command that was located in Tigray region. But this is not the case. What's happening in Amhara region essentially is a fight to exist. It's a fight for survivability. It's a fight for Amharas to defend their livelihood.
I see. Robert, let's talk about the reason behind this. We know that on the surface, the Fano fighters have spoken about the fact that they will not surrender to, the Prime Minister's intentions to dissolve all regional forces. But why is that so important for the Fano people, such that we are at this point?
Thank you. Yes, I think it's very crucial to understand that the Amhara region perhaps has some of the greatest security concerns in the country recently, and particularly since Prime Minister Abiy and his party came to power in 2018, there was essentially a consecutive sequence of targeted attacks against the Amhara people within the Amhara region, as well as outside. And so one testament to this was the Northern Ethiopia War, which, as my colleague Binia mentioned, started in November 2020. And that war, actually, devastating war, happened in 3 waves. And for the vast majority of the time of that conflict, the fighting and the occupation and the atrocities were happening in the Amhara region as well as in the Afar region. And so I think following this, there was a move by the federal government to come to an agreement with the TPLF, brokered by some of the Western diplomats. And this deal happened in Pretoria in November 2022. But unfortunately, this deal essentially sidelined the Amhara people, which had no independent representation. And because there was no independent representation, this led to essentially a backseat for justice and accountability for atrocities committed in the war, and essentially impunity to continue within the country. And what happened was the Abiy government, or the Abiy regime, essentially was emboldened to continue his targeting of the Amhara people. And so the targeting of Amhara people preceded the Northern War, and it continued after until the culmination of the war on Amhara, which has gone on now for 3 months since May 2023. And to be clear, we're talking about the Abiy regime declaring war And this was actually following a string of anti-government protests in the Amhara region. And so now what we're seeing is that the regime is targeting civilians using drone strikes, weaponized rape, destroying heritage sites, shutting down telecommunications and internet services. One example was that massacre in the Debre Elias Monastery. This is an ancient monastery that was occupied by worshippers, monks, and orphans, and regime forces actually entered in late May 2023 and mercilessly massacred hundreds of worshippers. And so what we're talking about here is the Fano, which are freedom fighters, as my colleague mentioned, basically self-defending against this genocidal invasion by the Abiy regime. And what they want is actually the removal of Abiy's forces, of non-Amhara forces from the Amhara region, and justice and accountability. And this is an extension of the protests that happened in April 2023, and before that in 2021, 2022. The Amhara region has been the only region that has held such consistent, widespread anti-government protests during the Abiy regime, as well as before the Abiy regime came to power, in which there were similar political concerns concerning the genocide in the Oromia region, and then for historical genocide in the Welkait and Raya region, which is another larger issue.
Right. So it sounds to me Abiy's intention to dissolve regional forces, starting with Amhara, was the last straw that broke the back of the region. Binyam, is that a case?
That is partially correct. Like my colleague Robo said, the conflict did not just begin by Abiy's decision to dismantle and demobilize the Amhara Special Forces. Now, this is very fundamental to know. The Amhara Special Forces, as well as the Fano Freedom Fighters, they are the essence and spirit of the Amhara people. The Amhara people do not have any trust in the so-called federal national forces, because these forces have been compromised by ethno-centrist and ethno-fascist and hijacked by the specifically is only serving the Prime Minister of Abiy Ahmed. And the fact that Abiy Ahmed's decision to only go after Amhara forces not only leaves Amhara region susceptible to an attack from TPLF, also from groups like the Oromo Liberation Army from a neighboring district, which they have shown on multiple occasions to attack a city in Showa called Ataye. They have attacked that city more than 12 rounds. They have destroyed the city. People have fled, properties damaged, infrastructures damaged. So you can tell the government is not only working with these forces, but is also unable to provide protection and defend the Amhara people. So
but Binyam, does the situation now do any better as far as security is for Amhara?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Right. So you've spoken about how the federal forces have left Amhara vulnerable to the TPLF and the Oromia people. But I'm asking now whether or not the situation now, the conflict as it is now, does it make the situation any better for the people of Amhara?
Well, the Amhara people have left with no choice. It's Abiy Ahmed region forces that have invaded Amhara region. They're using tanks. They're using drones attack. In the city of Gondar City, for instance, there's heavy fighting that happened in urban warfare. Like my colleague Robo said, they're using urban sites as well as UNESCO heritage sites like the Gondar Fasilides Castle to decimate the city.
Right.
And so the Amharas are fighting to survive and exist, because it is the Abiy Ahmed region forces that invaded the Amhara region.
So Robert, right. Robert, I want us to, clarify a few things. You mentioned that one of the, past reasons for why the situation or may have culminated in the situation that we are seeing today is the fact that the people of Amhara were left out of the Pretoria agreement. But the government has said that there were representatives on that team that were from Amhara, the reason there was no need for an independent team from the region.
Certainly. So I think that is definitely the claim by the government. But since the Abiy regime came to power, the central government has been dominated by the Oromo Prosperity Party. And so this has been a hegemonic transition from the TPLF, which we saw in the previous years since 1991. And unfortunately, the Pretoria deal actually engaged some members of the Prosperity Party, but the ones that actually went into Pretoria to negotiate were not the Amhara members. And with that being said, the Amhara Prosperity Party has been largely rejected. And as we're seeing in the current war, they've actually fled from many of the cities, and there are interim administrations being set up by the Fano. And so the protests over the last few years, which I mentioned earlier, were actually, in partly condemning the Amhara Prosperity Party and that local branch for being complicit in the historic genocide against the Amhara people perpetrated by the Abiy regime, the Oromo Liberation Army, as well as the TPLF and the EPRDF government before Abiy came to power. And I think those protests are really important to highlight because it was not just about the lack of a resolution in Pretoria. There was the genocide, the lack of political plurality. There was ethnic cleansing in the capital city of Addis Ababa, with non-Oromo residents being kicked out of their homes and their houses being demolished. Amhara residents were not able to travel to the capital city. There was political prisoners, so thousands of people being rounded up in the streets, which is being intensified even now. And then the lack of support for IDPs. And of course, a lack of resolution of Walqait and Raya. These areas of Walqait, Agadait, Adlamt, Setitumara, and Raya were actually historic Amhara lands that were annexed by the TPLF in the 1990s. And throughout that time, the Amhara indigenous residents actually faced a campaign of genocide and ethnic cleansing up until the war in northern Ethiopia, with the Mai Kadra massacre in November 2020, in which over 1,600 ethnic Amhara civilians were massacred by the TPLF, making it the single worst civilian
Robert,
massacre of the war.
Let's back up a little to the point where Amhara feels left out of the Pretoria deal, and I really do not wish that we belabor the point, but again, I do want clarification whether or not it was only Amhara that did not have independent representation there.
Certainly, it wasn't just the Amhara actually, because as I mentioned before, one of the impacted regions of the war was actually the Afar region as well. So, for example, there weren't any Afar representatives. Another belligerent of the war was the Eritreans. There was no Eritrean representation. And so, with this being said, we emphasize the Amhara exclusion because the Amharas have been systematically excluded from these processes in shaping Ethiopia as a country going back to the 1990s. And as I mentioned, when the TPLF came to power, they actually imposed a constitution in 1995, which imposed a system of ethnic apartheid. And that paved the way, for example, for the land grabs that I mentioned before, of Walqait and Raya, in which the Tigray region expanded its borders southward to incorporate these historic Amhara lands. And this was not the only historic annexation. There were others on the western frontier and the southern frontier. And this has actually, I think, paved the way for the ethnic violence and the war that we're seeing as we speak right now.
Very well. So, Biniam, let's talk about. You want to say something? I'll give you the time. But while you say that, I also want us to discuss the Fano fighters and the Amhara regional authorities, or the Amhara special forces as well. So it would appear that the position of the regional authorities, based on what we have learned, is quite different from what Fano holds. How do we reconcile the two positions as that of the Amhara people?
Yes, just to say just a few comments on the previous statement that you asked.
Right.
The reason Amharas is not only just not being invited to the Pretoria deal. Remember, this is, by the way, a quote from the president of the Amhara Regional Office for Reconstruction and Construction Fund. He mentioned an estimation of about $500 billion birr. That's more than 500 billion birr, or in American dollar, that's close to about 9.1 billion American dollars. That was damaged. That involved infrastructure, health facilities. That the vast majority of the war between the federal forces and the Tigray happened in the Amhara region. And people always say that the Amharas backed Abiy. Amhara did not back Abiy. Amharas were defending themselves because TPLF invaded the Amhara region. And the vast majority of that war happened in the Amhara region. They had no other option but to defend themselves. That's when you see these Fano fighters. By the way, I really want to to not use the word militia when you describe Fano. To me, that is undermining and really casting these are the sons and daughters of Amharas, and they are freedom fighters. They are protecting and defending more than 50 million Amharas that live in Ethiopia. And to go after that, the second question that you mentioned, it is true that the Amhara Prosperity Party is an apparatus that allows Abiy Ahmed to control the Amhara region. However, that structure is being disintegrated as we speak. Most of the Amhara Prosperity officials have fled the Amhara region, have fled Bahardar, Gondar, cities in Showa, and they have left to Addis Ababa. And they are under the protection of the so-called Republican Guards by Abiy Ahmed. And any of the leftover officials in the Amhara region have essentially signed a letter and resigned from their position as prosperity officials. So as we speak, as my colleague Robo said, the freedom fighters, the Fano fighters, when they control cities, they set up curfews. They protect government institutions like banks and schools to make sure that criminals don't act up. They set commands. They are actually, what they're doing is they are restoring the rule of law in the Amhara region. And the people of Amhara have such trust and veneration for these Fano fighters. And that's very clear indication, and it's important to know that.
I see. I do want to talk about, the control these freedom fighters have at the moment. We know of three towns: Lalibela, Kondar, and Desi. But what does this control that they have at the moment say about what appears to be the contestation between the federal government and the people of Amhara? Robel, could you take that question for me?
Certainly. And I think, as I said, initially the resistance of the Fano was in self-defense to the Abiy regime's military operation. They went into the region saying that they were going to neutralize so-called extremist forces. And extremist forces was essentially a euphemism for Amhara forces. And as I said, this had a connection to the Pretoria deal and with these lands of Welgait and Raya, which as a result of the Northern Ethiopia war, Amhara forces were actually able to reclaim following the historic annexation. And currently, the control of Amhara cities is an effect of the invasion in which the local Amhara Prosperity Party structure is being dismantled. There are interim administrations being installed. And unfortunately, the regime forces have actually preferred to engage in urban warfare, much of the time losing in military engagements and then pointing their guns at civilians to terrorize the civilians and to discourage the Fano resistance. But the reality is that these federal forces are not particularly good at what they've been doing. Historically, they haven't been able to protect the security of civilians in many places, and in fact have been complicit in the targeted violence and the Amhara genocide in the Oromia region, as well as during invasions of Amhara region. As my colleague Binia mentioned earlier, there was over a dozen invasions of the sub-province of Showa within Amhara region, in which cities such as Ataye and Showa Robit were damaged and destroyed, leveled on multiple occasions, and the federal forces actually did not provide protection for civilians, instead actually backed the invading Oromo Liberation Army forces, which crossed into the Amhara region. And so now it's a similar situation where the Fano are basically protecting their land from the invading federal forces, and the army, as I said, is not dominated by, it's not a pan-Ethiopian army. This is an army that's actually dominated by generals from the Oromo Prosperity Party. And the generals themselves have even went on record saying that they cannot win this war because they simply don't have the means. The defense capacity of the region is quite resilient. And the Fano, because they're fighting this war of self-defense, they have no choice but to fight. And the people actually do not trust the government, as I said before, with the protests. So the combination of the Amhara resistance protests with the Fano, I think, has made the region ungovernable for the Prosperity Party, and that's going to result likely in in more control of Amhara cities and towns. We actually have noted over
Right.
several dozen towns that are actually under Fano control or are contested.
I see. So, despite what you've said, that Fano is protecting, the people of Amhara, when the gun rings, it's unclear where it lands. So I want to find out what this means for residents in these areas where fighting is actively taking place, Binia.
Absolutely. You can imagine that's very devastating. My parents are from the Gondar region, northern Ethiopia. And just yesterday, I called my uncle in Gondar, and he told me that essentially everyone is in their homes, and that you could easily be hit by a gun flying by. And you can imagine hospitals closed, medications, telecommunications cut down, no internet services. The government essentially, Abiy Ahmed region forces are essentially obliterating and choosing urban warfare. Um, they they went into the Gondar hospital, which serves more than 7 million residents in Gondar, uh, which actually need a very vital supports. They choose that hospital as a means to choose their welfare. So what's been happening to civilians is devastating.
Mm.
And the Fano freedom fighters have have asked to pull out from the cities and to choose the warfare on a different location outside of the urban infrastructure. But the government deliberately is choosing these locations to also damage civilians and cause mass casualties in a way of his approach to defeating the Fano. But
I
that will
see.
not happen. As we speak, I want you to make it clear that Fano not only has the backing of the entire Amhara population, but it also has the backing of other Ethiopians who resist the ethno-fascist regime of Abiy Ahmed.
I see.
Abiy Ahmed needs to go.
Very well. When we come back, I want us to talk about the state of emergency that has been declared there. We'd also talk about whether or what it would take, rather, for Fano to come to the negotiating table, as some people have asked for. We'd also ask the implications of this for the entire peace process of Ethiopia post Tigray unrest. You're here on the square. I'll be right back. Don't go away. Today, our focus on the program is the unrest in Ethiopia's Amhara region. We've been discussing this very great conversation with Robel Alemu and Binyam Ambachu, who've been given the perspective of the Amhara people as far as this brewing conflict is concerned. But at this point, let's talk about government's actions so far. One of the things that we know clearly has been done is the institution of the state of emergency, following which we know there have been some arrests of young people, I believe, from the Amhara region. They believe they are linked to the activities that have taken place in that part of the country so far. Binyam, you start off with this one for us. Is this the best move at this point? Are we seeing a repeat of what took place in Tigray when the government was able to turn off the internet in those areas, and we heard of the things that took place afterwards? What are you seeing, Binya?
Absolutely. This conflict has been raging for several months now. The declaration of the state of emergency by Abiy Ahmed this is just a sort of a political move to say that any law operation that we're gonna essentially begin from now is justified. So if we kill civilians, it's justified. If we damage the Gondar castles, it's justified. So this is just a political manipulative move. More than 4,000 Amhara regular civilians, including actually one of the parliament member, Christian Tadele, which has, as a parliament member, the right to not to go to jail, essentially. He's been arrested. Other council members from the Addis Ababa council members have been arrested. And so you don't even have to have any link to so-called Fano. If you're in Amhara and if you resist Abiy Ahmed region, you are rounded and sent to camps. And by the way, these are not just regular, these are concentration camps. Some of these individuals that have been rounded up, we don't even know where they're located. We don't know where they're abouts. And I think other humanitarian organizations need to really demand the whereabouts of these individuals that are being rounded up. Because that's very, very important to know their safety and make sure that they are alive. But the move by Abiy Ahmed Ali essentially is a frantic one.
Right. Biniam, is there a reason why you would say that we need to verify if they are alive?
Absolutely. Like I said, because some of the people that are being abducted and rounded about, we don't know where they are located. They are going into a position of undisclosed location. And they may be used as some sort of bargaining chip, or before we know it, for better or worse, they may be killed. And so
right. So this is just a fear that you have that these arbitrary arrests could lead to people being killed?
Oh, certainly, I have that fear, but also the fact that they are being arrested and sent to undisclosed location. We don't know where they are abouts. And I think that's very important to know exactly where they are abouts.
And again, just to put it into perspective, when you say that we do not know where they are, that's because you have found out from maybe government authorities and they are unable to tell you where these people are?
Exactly, as well as we have independent media outlets and on the ground that are verifying and trying to tell us, and they have not found a place to locate them, essentially.
Fantastic. I know you wanted to say something else, but if I haven't, displaced your train of thought, you can go ahead. But in the meantime, I'll pose the same question to Robel with regards to government state of emergency, the arbitrary arrest because of the state of emergency, and the turning off of the internet in Amhara. It's a stark reminder of what took place in Tigray, isn't it?
What I can say here is that I think what Amharas have faced over the past 5-6 years under the Abiy administration and the time before that has been consistent. The genocide preceded the war in northern Ethiopia. It continued throughout the war in northern Ethiopia. If you look at the situation in Oromia, you have more than 1 million Amhara residents who have been ethnically cleansed, displaced to the Amhara region because that's the only place that they could find safety. Because within the Wodlega area, or within Western Oromia, you had the Oromo Liberation Army collaborating with federal forces, collaborating with Oromia region special forces to essentially massacre and ethnically cleanse these Amhara civilians. So the genocide preceded that, and part of that was the mass arrests. So these people are being profiled in the Amhara region, in the Addis Ababa city, the federal capital, in the Oromia region, and elsewhere in the country, because the Abiy regime wants to essentially impose this hegemonic vision that it basically borrowed. It's a carbon copy of what the TPLF did. During the 27 years of TPLF rule, we had multiple genocides against the Amhara people, against the Anuak, against the Ogaden or the Somali people, against even the Oromo people. And so when that change happened and when Abiy came to power, the people had hoped that he would bring some type of fundamental change. For example, freedom of press, respect for human rights. But we're actually seeing that these things have worsened. You have now Amhara journalists who are arbitrarily arrested, dozens of journalists, media staff, opposition figures, humanitarians, academics, students who are rounded up in the thousands and put in jails. And this preceded the current war. We saw a large round of mass arrests actually last year, starting in May 2022, because people were opposing the government. So essentially, this is more of the genocide, the ethnic apartheid that the Oromo Prosperity Party has copied from its predecessors, the TPLF. And so even now, the concern is that as these atrocities are happening with the state of emergency, the telecommunications shutdown, the internet shutdown, he's trying to make it difficult for example, citizens to document what's happening. He wants to commit mass atrocities in the dark, which is a stark, actually, as you recalled, it's very similar to what happened in the northern Ethiopia war, because, as I said, for many months, the Amhara region was invaded, and we had industrial scale looting of hospitals, schools, religious sites, massacres across dozens of Amhara cities. A similar situation happened in Afar region, and unfortunately, we're seeing a continuation of that because of this cycle of impunity, which the Pretoria deal failed to address. And so I think if we come to solutions, we need to start to revisit some of these dealings and correct the mistakes of the past.
And we'll look at those solutions in a bit. But I do want to talk about the people in the Amhara region again, because we know that the WHO has said that they would like to have free, uninterrupted access to the area for humanitarian purposes. How significant is the humanitarian situation in Amhara at the moment? Biniam, can you share?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very significant. Like I mentioned, just recently I called my families in Gondar, and they essentially are in darkness, right? The telecommunications are cut down. Essentially, the water supplies are cut down. There's no medications in the hospitals. People cannot freely go in and out. You can imagine the per capita, people don't have that much wealth in the country, so they live by working as a day laborers day and night. And so, the further that this war continues, we will see a very stark environment in Amhara region. The civilians are calling, like the Fano fighters, what they're doing as they liberate these towns, they're trying to restore the rule of law. I will guarantee you, if humanitarian organizations visit those regions that are under Fano's control, they would allow them to operate in peace. They would allow them to provide humanitarian services to the people in need.
Indeed.
The Fano have a simple goal. They want to, they say no to the Abiy Ahmed region prosperity structure. They do not want to be led by that. Those days are gone.
I see. I do. Well, right now, let's talk about what it would take for the Fano fighters, the people of Amhara, to come to the table and talk. Biniam, despite what you have said about the leaders of the Amhara region at this point, particularly as you pointed out, those who have fled the area, they're calling for the Fano fighters to sit at the table with the federal government and talk this out. Robert, what I want you to discuss for us now is whether or not that will be a feasible option and what it would take for Fano fighters. I know you're not the spokesperson, but analyzing the situation, what would it take for Fano fighters to come to the table?
Thank you. I think it's really important to understand that following the Pretoria deal, there was this notion that there was peace in Ethiopia, but unfortunately, the implementation of that deal, which was exclusionary, did not bring lasting peace. And so what we saw actually was a lack of disarmament of the TPLF, and then a unilateral disarmament of the Amhara forces. And so there's actually ongoing occupations of Amhara territories by TPLF forces in areas such as Tadlemt and Wag. And despite this, the Abiy regime actually colluded with the TPLF to go after Amharas. And so the protests, part of which partly addressed the issue of the disputed territories, also addressed a lot of these other issues. And the idea behind that was to have a peaceful civil demonstration without resorting to violence. Unfortunately, instead of actually answering the demands of the people, the Abiy regime actually decided to shoot at unarmed protesters during that period. And similar things happened in 2022, 2021, going back to 2016, when the Amhara resistance first began as civil demonstrations against the TPLF's decades of genocide and apartheid against the Amhara people. And so currently, coming back to the current situation, this is actually what resulted in the escalation of the resistance into this Fano armed resistance, which has potential to become an insurgency, because the Fano are basically tired of what's been happening to the Amhara people. These are everyday people who have picked up arms to defend their communities. And I think the Amhara people have repeatedly shown their commitment to coming to peace. On multiple instances, there were efforts to actually have deliberations on a local level, and the regime forces actually promised to withdraw from these areas, but they would use those opportunities to, again, regroup and then re-attack these communities. And so there's very, very fragile trust in the government. Actually, I could say there's no trust. And unfortunately, this has led to many of these people actually asking for the resignation of the prime minister and his prosperity party and the withdrawal of non-Amhara forces. And so if you don't have the withdrawal of these non-Amhara forces from Amhara region, it's very difficult to convince that there's goodwill. And so there's also the issue of the political prisoners, thousands of people who have been imprisoned for their Amhara identity. There needs to be a release of these prisoners, restoration of telecommunications and internet services, which have been sporadically turned off in many parts of the area of the region, provision of resources for farmers, for example, which are actually not being provided with necessary resources to farm, which is an intent to starve the population, and then humanitarian support for IDPs. The IDP situation or the humanitarian situation that's happening as a result of this war is compounded on the crisis that led to the displacement from the Oromo region, the genocide there, and that preceded the war in northern Ethiopia. So you have now over 3-4 years of mass displacement from various parts of the region, and you have all of these people who don't have homes, who don't have jobs, and are actually struggling to survive because they're not getting any assistance from international humanitarian organizations. And that's partly because of the Abiy regime obstructing access to this aid and not providing it themselves.
I see.
And so this needs to happen in the short term, and in the long term, there needs to be independent investigations into the Amhara genocide. There needs to be a transitional justice mechanism, which goes back before November 2020, before the start of the Northern War, to include the historic Amhara genocide. And there needs to be an inclusive national dialogue process in which people can come together, the Ethiopian people can come together and resolve their issues without these politicians, and to potentially even revise the divisive and exclusionary constitution which was imposed on the Ethiopian people.
Indeed. Miniam, you have the last word on this. And I do want you to take a look at some of the things that the government has also said about the Fano people, despite all that both of you have described, the Fano people, the Fano fighters to be. For the government, these are people who are causing mayhem in Amhara, including freeing prisoners. Now, analyze the situation for me in the context of Ethiopia's intention, Ethiopia's bid to recover from what it had seen in the past few years in Tigray, and what impact the Amhara situation now could have on that.
Absolutely. I will get back to the short and long term goals, and I'll make it very precise of what we need to do for Ethiopia to move forward. But I want to just say one thing very clearly, in that if you look at Western professors, the likes of Kipjo Tronvold, for instance, recently tweeted, this guy he's a professor and research at Oslo New University and the college and director for the Oslo analysis. And then the likes of Martin Plant, for instance, he's the South Africa and the Horn of Africa Fellow Student of the Commonwealth. I mentioned these individuals, I know, because they're not a guest and they can't defend themselves, but I'm just reading their tweets. For instance, Tronvold said, the Ethiopian government has declared a war on Fano rebellion in Amhara. There are strong claims that Eritrea is providing support and training. See, this is what they're doing. They are trying to, tirelessly work to implicate Eritrea in this conflict. Eritrea is not involved in this conflict. This is an internal matter. This is a way to deliberately sabotage and undermine Amhara's relation with the West. You see, by painting Amharas as ally of Eritrea, we know Eritrea's huge involvement of dictatorship, they're trying to undermine Amhara's struggle. This is a matter of internal affairs. This has only involved the Amhara forces, the Fano freedom fighters, and Abiy region forces. There's no outside involvement. So that needs to be very, very clear.
Right.
But a way forward. I think Ethiopia what it truly needs is a new future, a new government, a new uh, reconciliation among all of the stakeholders in the country. Now, when Fano fights, they are not only fighting for the Amharas, they are fighting for everyone that is oppressed. They are fighting for the ethno-fascist ideology that have engulfed Ethiopia for the past 50 years.
Right.
That needs to go. There needs to be a transitional justice and accountability for the victims of Amhara genocide in Oromia. More
Indeed.
than 1 million Amharas have been internally displaced, and they are in Debre Berhan, in IDP camps. You don't see no Western diplomats or any humanitarian aid visiting those EDP camps. Those are Amhara individuals who fled the so-called their own country
Indeed.
in the nearby district in Oromia.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we'll have to end today's conversation here. I hope that we can meet again and discuss this further, hopefully on a better note. There will be no more fighting in the Amhara region. Robel Biniam, thank you so much for your company here on The Square.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
having us.
And to you watching, thank you so much for joining us for today's edition of Village Square Africa. I am Kemini Amano.